Hello there and welcome to our special coverage of Ukraine-Russia conflict. Today's latest goes as follows. EU leaders will meet today to discuss new sanctions against Moscow, with Bloc Foreign Policy Chief Joseph Borrell saying they would agree a deal despite resistance from Hungary and other eastern states to ban on Russian oil imports. Russian Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna will meet Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky in Kiev to express France's solidarity with Ukraine. All in all, the geopolitical tensions in Europe and globally have spiked, and already contentious issues across the globe have become increasingly fraught. Deterrent China-wide, Russia remains a top priority for the West. The US Army serves as a key player to joint operation in the Indo-Pacific, ready to support and enable to join force in a future conflict scenario. Meanwhile, Russia's war in Ukraine demonstrates the importance of ground support for NATO alliance and other countries. As the war continues with no end in sight, there has been increased interest in targeting Russia's oil exports, which has been financing its war in Ukraine so far. And to this end, so many questions are raised. How Russia will continue its operation in Ukraine if the oil business cut down suddenly? And could Europe take the risk to cut off Russian gas supplies? All this is going to be analyzed today in our special coverage by our panel of guests. I'm joined live via Skype by Mr. Panyo Basu, Assistant Professor of Political Science from New Delhi, India, and Mrs. Christina Belemenko, PhD in Political Science and International Relations from Rome, Italy. Gentlemen, madam, thank you so much for being with us in this debate. The discussion begins right after this break. Before we delve into our discussion, fierce battles are taking place in eastern Ukraine for control of the Donbas region, as the Russian forces threaten the cities of Severodonetsk and its neighbor Luhansk after Moscow declared control of the strategic town of Liman. Let's follow this report.
For the first time since the start of the Russian special military operation in Ukraine, President Volodymyr Zelensky visited the Kharkiv region in the east of the country, from which Moscow has withdrawn in recent weeks. Wearing a bulletproof vest, Zelensky saw the heavily destroyed buildings in and around Kharkiv. After the visit, President Zelensky fired the head of security services of the Kharkiv, who had not worked in the defense of the city since the start of the conflict, according to him.
I came, I saw, and I fired the head of the security services of the region of Kharkiv, because he had not worked in the defense of the city since the first days of the war.
Zelensky also emphasized the importance of the liberation of the Donbas region, where Russian troops are gaining a lot of territory.
The liberation of Severodonetsk and Donbass is a fundamental task for us. We are doing everything to prevent its full capture.
Speaking at a regular press briefing, Defense Ministry spokesman Igor Konashenkov said that Russian missiles had struck a depot located within one of the industrial enterprises in the Donbas region.
High-precision long-range missiles of Russian aerospace forces destroyed an important ammunition depot of the armed forces of Ukraine in the warehouse within one of the industrial enterprises in the east.
Bombarded almost daily since the start of the Russian operation on February 24, Kharkiv, the country's second city, has been experiencing a break for a few weeks. With the departure of Russian troops to the east and south, the eastern part of the city nevertheless remains sometimes targeted.
I'll be starting with you, Dr. Christina, since you are in Europe, where all it's going. So, in the ground now in Severodonetsk, the situation is increasingly grim. Ukraine's military is suffering serious losses in the battle for the city. All this, and Ukraine is still pleading for more effective weapons that would make it stronger than Russia. So why is the West taking too much time to send weapons? Is it because of the risk of wider war between Russia and NATO, or this is a part of the plan?
If we have to be honest, inside the European society, even in Italy, we have the division about what is going on with the with the armament that Europe and the United States are going to send in Ukraine. So there is a pressure that's coming from the society, basically, and that's a problem for the political system. It's not maybe a plan to take so much time to send this armament to Ukraine, because all nations and all states have their own interest in this war, and basically the interest is to make Ukraine a winning part and not a lose one. So I think basically it's just a society problem and a problem of perception.
Quite understood. Coming to you, Mr. Basu, what is your interpretation so far for this recent event? Don't you think that the only way out of this war is negotiation? And what are you saying about what Mrs. Christina is saying, that all countries has some an interest in this war?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think any conflict, for that matter, the only resolution is negotiation. That is the crux of it. A negotiation will always take place, but for example, Russia will keep on fighting, like the kind of escalation that you see in the eastern parts, be it new cities being taken up. The idea is that it can be another Mariupol event. So the idea is that Russia will keep on doing and the kind of aggressions until and unless there, for example, the kind of sanctions that are happening has a very positive effect in their own cultural narrative. So I think most of the conflict will be, I think, even if there are ammunitions or even howitzers being exported to Ukraine for their help, understanding how the weaponry works in their own context, getting it trained by the Ukrainians. If you look at the number of troops, it also becomes, the question is that whether they are well trained enough to understand these ammunitions and not. These are like reports that are coming in right now. So that will be very interesting. And of course, as Ma'am was also saying, that every country has its own context to look at these war. If I talk about India and the South Asian countries, they have their own understanding of these wars, and even the aspect of not commenting on it, having a very cold response to these events, not having, even in the Quad summit, not really talking about Russia for that aspect. These are like very strong messages. Even silence is a very strong message. So yeah,
perfectly understood. Thank you so much, Mr. Basu. Coming back to you, Mrs. Christina, from the idea that you said all countries has some interest in this war, don't you think that because they are taking too much time to send weapons, they want this war and this military operation, so-called, to continue because it serves their interest, and mainly it serves the interest of US and UK, because this war is weakening Russia militarily and economically. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, sure, I agree, and I think it's this war is started by Russia, but every country, as you mentioned, USA and Great Britain, basically have interest in the continuing of this war, because in a certain sense we have the great opportunity, we have an important window that can make Russia minor in the international relations, basically because we have the opportunity to put pressure on Russia from inside, so we can create this secession phenomena that's coming from inside and not outside. The economic pressure and sanctions are going to put pressure on the population and not in the direct way on the government, the elite of the Russian Federation. We have that inside the Russian Federation. We have 193 different ethnic groups that are talking in 100 of different languages. So it's an important and particular opportunity for some states to create a collapse in a certain sense of Russia, and maybe we have in some terms a return to a Cold War, basically this block of the Western society and the societies of dictatorship and anti-democratic states.
Quite understood. Coming back to you, Mr. Basu, one of my guests previously said that Ukraine is being used as a grenade, as a tool to harm Russia. So, do you agree with this?
I'm not really comfortable with these these statements, but I understand the context of it. For example, if you look at why Russia, whether the sanctioning on Russia will affect other European countries or not. Well, the easy answer to that is that yes, it might affect it to some extent. Looking at Russia and Ukraine has, people are not really talking about the agricultural fertilizer industries that will be affected, considering the kind of potash exports happen from these two particular countries. So obviously there will be effects to that matter. But if you just look at the size of these, for example, if you look at the Russian economy, how large it is like $1.8 trillion economy. And if you look at the larger EU economy, it is like close to $18 trillion. So if you look at just the sizes of these two economies, it might look insignificant, but obviously it will take a lot of help from the NATO allies to kind of balance out the kind of economic sanctions and the repercussions it will have in the larger EU.
Perfectly understood. All right, moving on to the second point in our discussion. The new French Minister of Foreign Affairs, Catherine Colonna, visiting Ukraine, headed on Monday to Bucha, to the suburbs of Kiev, where massacres of civilians took place, of which Russian troops are accused by the Ukrainian authorities. After the departure of the Russian soldiers from the locality at the end of March and discovery of hundreds of corpses of Ukrainian civilians, Bucha became the symbol of war crimes imputed to Russia by Ukraine. Dr. Christina, a way of joining NATO membership, the French President Emmanuel Macron said it will take decades for Ukraine to be accepted into the European Union. How can you consider this contradiction? EU is trying to help Ukraine. At the same time, they are refusing Ukraine to be joined. This refusal based on what?
I think that basically it is given by the division that was in the first place. We had that the European Union was completely united in the sanctions and in the response to this invasion. But after all this time, we see that there are some problems, and these problems are related to resources, natural resources, and all geopolitical aspects. And I think that maybe the problem is that we can't be really, we can ban Russia from the international relations, and we can't increase in proportion that we have inside the relations between Russia and the European Union. So basically, they are trying to find a negotiation that will be okay for both, so Ukraine and Russia, and they are trying to have this kind of diplomacy, of negotiable diplomacy that will be okay for both sides. So maybe that's the problem.
Perfectly understood. Mr. Basu, don't you think that there is a sort of two-faced challenge between the NATO and EU leaders? In other words, some of them are trying to escalate the war, such as UK, Germany, whom they keep calling all the countries to join their alliance. And on the other hand, France and Turkey are looking forward to bring the peaceful resolution close to the table. And this is why Turkey is objecting Finland and Sweden membership.
Again, thank you for that question. That is a very pertinent question, of course, because if you look at Turkey's policies as well, I won't agree that it is just because it wants to take a very peaceful stance, but it also has to do with the kind of positioning of the PKK parties and the autonomy separatist groups that are stationed in these countries. And there are kind of inhibitions and suspicion from these countries, especially Turkey. Uh, with the aspect of double facedness, always like UK as a country has been a very staunch like an anti Russia for that matter, and that's why you see that even today whatever conflict is not just about this conflict. If you look at other conflicts in the Middle Eastern, the MENA region, or even the South Asian region, you will find these kind of dualities. So it is not just specific about this conflict, it has its roots in other conflicts as well if you predate the Russia-Ukraine invasion.
Understood. All right. Another point to be discussed. German Economy Minister Robert Habeck on Sunday expressed fears that European Union's unity was starting to crumble ahead of summit to discuss an oil embargo against Russia and plans to cut dependence on Russian energy. EU leaders will meet on Monday and Tuesday to discuss a new sanctions package against Russia, which could also include an oil embargo and a program aiming to speed up ending dependence on fossil fuels, including Russian gas. Coming back to you again, Dr. Christina, Hungary may oppose six package of sanctions and oil embargo against Russia. Bulgaria is threatening not to support the new set of sanctions. So, do you think that European unity is at stake, despite them claiming that Europe is united? However, it seems to be the opposite, since some European countries are against sanctions on Russia.
Yeah, basically we have a distinction fracture inside the European society, and that basically is given by the fact that the European Union and European states are different perception of Russia. It's obvious that the Baltic states, for example, have an history that remind them about what the Russian Federation and the USSR was, and what Russia it could be if we talk in the term of politics. So we have that in Europe, in all other states, we don't have this reminder, and they did not see the Russia in the same sphere, in the same perception that other states like Poland, the Baltic states have. So basically, I think that's the problem. The problem is in different cultures that we have inside the European Union.
Quite understood. Mr. Basu, previously one of our show guests, as already mentioned, Mr. Hussein Askari, who is a member of the Belt and Road Initiative in Sweden. He told us that the sanctions imposed on Russia is a suicidal policy that will harm European countries more than Russia itself. Do you agree with that?
Again, I understand the context of it, but I won't really agree to it completely. Like, I understand that there is high dependencies. If you look at the trade-offs, EU countries are much more trade-centric with Russia as compared to US. So if there is any kind of sanctions on Russia, it like logically it will have an effect on other EU countries. But I won't really agree, considering that earlier I also mentioned the sizes of these two economies. And if the NATO, obviously, there is a hypothesis here in my arguments that if the NATO allies understands and has a larger, like alternative supply chains, be it in with respect to oils or be it respect to like wheats or agricultural fertilizers, then it won't really harm EU countries as being feared.
No. All right. Moving on to another point. As war in Ukraine rages, Serbia's president announced that he secured an extremely favorable natural gas deal with Russia during a telephone conversation Sunday with Russian President Vladimir Putin. Serbian President Alexander Vučić has refused to publicly condemn Russia's military operation, and Serbia has not joined Western sanctions against Moscow. A former pro-Russian ultranationalist claims that he wants to take Serbia into the European Union, but has spent recent years commenting ties with Russia a long time ally. Dr. Christina, Western leaders are divided between those who think they can work with Vladimir Putin's Russia once the war is over and those who think they cannot. The row is leading to disputes over the aiming of Ukraine, the feasibility of enforcing a Russian oil import embargo, and whether Kiev will have to accept a further loss of territory at the end of the war as the price for peace. What do you think about this?
I think that the problem is Ukraine is even if the President Zelensky accepts this kind of agreement, there will be a revolution, a new sort of revolution inside the Ukrainian society, and it can be a problem for the agreement itself because we clearly see what happened in 2014. So in Ukraine is very high the sense of pertinence and the sense of nationality and of Ukraine, what Ukraine is. And they are there is this high understandable perception of Russia and what it was, and they clearly don't want the society don't want to give them territorial portion of Ukraine. So I think it's could be a great treaty for them.
Understood. Mr. Basso, how can you read the economic situation in Europe now? Some of the countries are rapidly trying to find alternatives for Russian gas, such as Italy, Germany, and on the other hand, Serbia, Bulgaria, they are still focusing over Russia's oil. How can you explain this contradiction? And to some extent, will this be very beneficial for Asia?
Thank you for the question. I think EU had already, like even before this escalation happened, EU had considerable plans of like slashing the dependence on Russian oil for a very long time. Like even the aim was to significantly slash it off by 2023. So diversification is always the answer. If you look at like countries like Brussels, for example, they have already started talks with countries like Qatar and Turkey, South Korea and Japan also to some extent to reduce their dependencies. But obviously it won't be very easy. Like it's very easier to say rather than done. So it will be difficult. But I am much more concerned about the fertilizer industry because it's very difficult to find like alternatives to those aspects as compared to gas. Because even if you look at US to some extent, even the very famous Nordic streamline, that is also a very good alternative. So it won't really matter after a point of time, but initially the turnover will be difficult.
Understood. On Sunday, Germany's coalition government and the Conservative Alliance reached an agreement on the terms of 100 billion euros increase in military expenditures. Both parties agreed to create a special budget for the armed forces after more than 3 hours of negotiations in Berlin. The special fund, according to German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, is a significant step forward for Germany's and Europe's security. On Twitter, Olaf Scholz stated that with 100 billion euros, the Bundeswehr would be able to better execute its defensive duty than ever before.
This is a good day. Immediately after the outbreak of the war that Russia started against Ukraine, I announced in German Bundestag that we will spend more on defense and that we will launch a special fund for the army, a special fund of 100 billion euros, so that we are now able, together with this money and budget, to invest 2% of our economic output in defense in the coming years.
Dr. Christina, Rome's status is well clear. No more reliance on the Russian gas. Russian diplomats were fired out and Italian officials, they could manage to find gas alternatives so far from Gulf countries and Algeria, Angola from Africa. Yet, Germany has nothing concrete, likewise Italy, but they keep escalating the situation with Russia. Isn't it risky to some extent to enter war with giant Russia, armless, without any weapon?
The problem is that every nation has, it is dependent from Russia in the sense, clearly, Italy is much less dependent in the sense, but Germany, like for 58%, so it's very a lot. I don't think that it could be an escalation about the relations of Europe and Russia, even because Germany is inside the NATO, and we clearly understand that NATO don't want to participate in a direct way in this war, even if they help and doing so much for Ukraine. They don't want to be a part of this war.
Understood. Mr. Basu, this Ukraine-Russia conflict clearly will reshape the world order as long as it goes longer. Asia and Africa now became the main sources for European countries economically. But on the other hand, the world basket, the bread basket, Ukraine and Russia, is suffering huge shortages, and all other countries are paying the price. So the question should be raised now. Maybe we could find alternative for Russian gas, but can we find a replacement for Ukraine and Russia wheat and grains?
Yeah, that's again a very important question, because if you look at the stats of it, Ukraine and Russia on a total make up like 29% of the global export market. I'm just talking about wheat here. So it will be difficult for sure, but still, like it's on a positive note. There are countries like US, Canada, and India for some extent that can be like suitable alternatives. But for example, even now, like Ukrainian exports of wheats are affected because they cannot really channel the Black Sea because of the Russian forces. So it will be difficult for some extent to open up those routes. But alternatives are clearly like India, Canada, and US are clear alternatives. But here again, I would emphasize on not just wheat or the bread basket, as you call it, but also the agricultural fertilizer industries. As I've been repeatedly saying, that finding alternatives to fertilizers will be a problem, and that will create crises. Because if you look at where these wheats are going, it's countries like Middle Eastern countries, or even very politically fragile countries where it might start a lot of ethnic strifes between groups if there are like shortages of food grains. So it has a larger repercussion. So I hope that these three countries are planning to be alternatives.
Understood. Mrs. Christina, last question to put an ad for this show. This last week, the Algerian president, Mr. Abdelmajid Tebboune, was in Italy. So how can you read and your interpretation as a PhD in international relations, the new agreements between Algeria and Italy, in the same time where Russia is still having an alliance with Algeria?
I think that basically the thing here is that Algeria is trying to take the best part inside this war, and to reconsider her role inside the international relations, and to be an important part of them. Obviously, in economic terms, we understand that for Algeria is more convenient in some way to start a new partnership in economic way with Italy and with all European countries, because it could be a way to increase your economy basically through different export, through the oil export in Italy, and also in all the other European countries that are trying to find an alternative to the Russian resources.
Quite interesting. To this end, thank you so much, dear guests, Mrs. Christina from Rome, Italy, Mr. Basil from India. Thank you so much for being with us in this show. And for your thorough analysis, thank you so much, dear viewers, for keeping it here in us in Al 24 News. I'm Abdulrahim Kashu, and bye for now.